coming from my undergrad classrooms and very varied kind of teaching. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the way this industry, so I work on labor in the leather industry, and it's kind of obvious when you think of leather, you kind of assume it will be caste-based leather, and kind of there's a kind of this thing of assumption of abjectness, of stigmatized labor, etc. The part about my work that I can't convey to you, most dominant part is the smell. So I can't show you the workplace, I can't show you a very, very important part of this, of what laboring in leather work means. So I don't know if you, like in around Calcutta, there's this place near called Tangra, which has now become real estate, like it's got a very differently, tanneries have been shifted. But there's a bridge there, so I remember my mother telling me when she's a child that that bridge is 4 number bridge, and as you pass it, what you get is the smell. So this characteristic smell which I can't really describe, but let me just show you just a few kind of picture photographs of some of the tanneries. One, there are some from the early 20th century and some from the 2006-7 period, when 6 to 10 period when I visited some of these. It's already long time back. So this is so leather industry as such gets linked to the international market, to global circuits of commodity production in the late 19th century. And this is just a graph to show the value of exports of hides and skins. When I say hides, I mean cattle, larger animals, skins of goats and sheep. So India gets kind of mapped or linked to this, and it's a replacement for Brazilian hides, that's another matter. So it's the international market, though that's the one kind of reason for a huge need of production of hides and skins in India. And the second is, of course, the bigger, the more important, the earlier reason was the colonial army. So military needs, especially for lower kind of sort of the Indian soldiers and so on, those begin to be provided from India. So places like Kanpur, for instance, will grow like that, like the tanning will grow. And one very big reason, of course, is that so it's around then that it begins to get mapped, and the numbers that are available begin to be the numbers get to be known. So what I'll do is I'll talk about a few areas, and I'll talk about the labor processing together, like just the places where caste is coming in, right? So how maybe we can think about this labor and caste, how does that work? How do they come together? That we shouldn't assume that both are the same over time. Prabhu was talking about status and contract yesterday, but even status doesn't remain static. So just want to bring in those. So how are hides and skins collected in India? Remember that cattle hides are not, slaughter is not that common. So hides are mostly, in most parts of India, they were natural deads. So what are called murdari in northern India. So there's murdari and halali kind of hides. So what it meant was that there was a huge, this linkage, this not just linkage to the market, but this huge demand, domestic demand as well, means that they have to be collected regularly, right? Collected systematically, and there has to be like across the country, and so the networks of collection come up. So they're kind of, so dead cattle have to be systematically collected, flayed, the hides reach to markets. You can imagine that with the coming of the railways, that becomes easier. And not to the market, they have to be processed, right? Transportation, they have to be processed. The hides and skins, so there emerge what are called clusters at different points where they get processed. So you can think of the use of what kind of labor, like who is going to get drawn in. So what you'll have, now remember the thing is that there's also caste of materials, right? So caste also works through that. So raw hides and skins are highly stigmatized substances, as are carcasses. So in the traditional networks of collection of hides and skin production, there would be occasionally cattle would die in the village, and one or two family members, one or two people who had the responsibility or whatever belonging to certain castes maybe, they would be collecting those and occasionally doing that work, right? But what now begins to happen is this work is done much more systematically. It needs to be, there's a huge kind of reorganization of this kind of work, and people are much more systematically connected to these kinds of raw materials, these hides and skins and so on, within the while being connected to a modern economy and to capitalist sort of circuits of production. So, so there's this kind of hides and skins which are wastes at one time. So there are two kinds of conflicts that occur, which are quite interesting. One is there are huge allegations in the middle of the 19th century, and which various scholars have worked on, and I've also found evidence in different parts of the country, that the leatherworking groups are poisoning cattle for the hides, right? So cattle poisoning papers, and these are so Ramnarayan Rawat found a lot of evidence across UP. I found evidence from Western India, from Bengal, etc. Because arsenic was used to preserve skins, and it was believed that it was also being used by these groups because only they could touch various leatherworking castes, so-called leatherworking castes. I'll come to that in a bit. But they are also, so there's this network, there's this cattle poisoning kind of scares. The other conflict that occurs is over ownership of carcasses of animals. In many parts of the country, the cattle owner, like the ownership of the animal would transfer to these groups because, you know, hides and skins didn't have such extensive use earlier. But now in Bombay, for instance, you have cases in the High Court as well, which are basically conflict over the hides, which the owner of the cattle can't touch, but they need the labor of the Dalit groups to remove it. But so there's this huge kind of contradiction, and courts then finally begin to decide in favor of the owners as well. But the Dalits also are, because they are the only ones who can extract this material. So this is another kind of vector in which sort of caste and stigma comes in, but this peculiarity that it is sort of very, very profitable, and the owners of the cattle cannot touch it. But then they claim it, and what they do is they deploy other caste groups. So in Maharashtra, in Bombay, for instance, they'll deploy monks who are permitted to touch these materials. When the Mahars become much more militant, so they'll deploy them. So there are a huge number of, there are quite a few cases of this nature. So the other thing that will happen, so what's happening is reorganization of production, and then you have these kind of networks of procurement and supply, systematic collection. So it's an entirely, my argument really is that it is an entirely new industry. It's a modern industry, right? And you have these what are called clustered kind of production, tanning kind of areas around Calcutta, around Kanpur, around Madras, and places like Agra will come up. There's a slightly different route by how Agra develops, and Kanpur as well. But a lot of these export-oriented tanning clusters, what happens across Madras province is that there are many small towns which get linked to the port in Madras, but you have this kind of dispersed network. So you have completely new kind of sites of production, new kind of dense sort of areas of dense sort of coming up of tanneries and dense small tanneries, mostly manual, even up to the 20th century, and there'll be kind of so what is needed there is huge amount of labor of people who can touch these materials. Maybe even replicating just what the village tanner would do, but the concentration is completely different. The labor process, the chemical, eventually chemicals will come in, but initially the actual labor process may be the same, but it's done by people, on a different scale altogether. So this concentration, reorganization is entirely new. Sort of also it's important to remember that these groups groups which are recruited into tanning. So there's a lot of concern from the late 19th century about labor. So around Kanpur, for instance, there's a lot of evidence. Kanpur and various sites in Madras province, the labor becomes a determinant for setting up of these tanneries, right? So setting up of these clusters, like where people are available. Because why? There are two reasons. It's a hot country. Hides and skins will perish. So they need to be processed fast. They will rot otherwise. And you need kind of controllable, available labor force. So this is my quibble about calling this a traditional industry. It's entirely modern. What's happening in the 19th century, the late 19th century is entirely modern. It is caste-based recruitment, but it's also important to remember, this is the other story of caste, is that actually you don't have any ready-made kind of labor market. There are no people on this scale are not available who can do this work. They don't know this work because it is occasional work in the traditional setup, right? You have the skilled craftsmen, etc., the people who are making leather products. That's a different set of people. But people who can touch and do this kind of really brutal work, which involves continuous kind of close, intimate contact with raw hide, skins, flesh, and literally it is rotting material. It's controlled putrefaction. That's what tanning is. I'll just show you the labor processes. So there aren't people available. So what you do is basically you bring in whoever is ready. So that the concerns all the way up to the Industrial Commission of 1916-18 is that how to get suitable labor. So the boundaries of suitability is people who are available and who can touch these materials. So the perishability and the stigma form the boundaries of that labor market. I mean, they are the basis on which whoever can touch it and be available close by. So, and very different logics are used in the north and the south. In southern India and Madras also, Madras province is going to give, labor will go into Bombay from Madras. So you also have specialization of merchants as well, right? Traders will also begin to specialize fully in, and there's some castes of Muslims particularly who become specialized sort of leather traders, sort of trading only in leather. And there are castes like the Labbais and the Rautans in northern and southern Tamil Nadu, for instance, who begin to specialize they're also not specialists before this. So this specialization, reorganization is entirely new and entirely in the context of the connection with the capitalist sort of world market, systems of production, with colonial economy. And so they get specialized, and many of them will then turn to this kind of preliminary processing, which is what's happening in India. And in the south and the north, different logics are used to recruit labor. So I'm sorry, I'm using caste names just descriptively because they're used in the sources, so please excuse me. So in Kanpur and Calcutta, you have this thing of that we have to recruit suitable labor is determined by, so the chamars are considered suitable labor because they are available. Now in Calcutta, you have migrants from different subgroups of chamars coming from UP and Bihar largely. And in around Kanpur also, you have mostly from the regional, nearby regions, you have migration of. So there the argument is that these are traditional leather workers, as if they have traditional skills. Remember that there are no traditions. This specialization is part of what colonial ethnography is doing, that linking people to continuous leather work as if, but there wasn't that kind of leather work. They're mostly agricultural laborers, as evidence shows. And similarly, in the southern part, you have the opposite argument is used. So in the north, traditional, that they have that becomes the excuse, that's the alibi for recruiting these workers into this very brutal labor processes. Of course, caste-based templates of labor control on the shop floor are deployed, but this argument that they have traditional skills and this is the work they can do. And we can discuss in the question answers how actually moving up the hierarchy on the shop floor is also difficult. Moving up to drier labor processes for them becomes difficult. They get stuck with these kinds of work. In southern India, and because you have merchants migrating with workers from, say, regions like Tirunelveli into Dharavi, which becomes a tanning cluster which becomes a place where a lot of tanneries, and all the way up to I think 2010-12, I've seen illegal tanneries running there. But now, of course, Dharavi is a very different place. But you have these kind of migrant sort of Tamil Muslims from southern Tamil Nadu Madras going, and the workers are all Paryans. So in Madras city, in all the small clusters across Madras, you have Paryans, the specialized leatherworking, so-called leatherworking castes. There are Chakilians and Madigas in the Andhra region, but now you have a rejection of those castes. And there is a specific reason given that they are used to spoiling good leather. Like they know the methods, and their methods are wrong. So we need to recruit people who can touch this material but are trainable. So opposite logics are used. These are completely contingent, and my argument is that they're actually the largest numbers of Dalit sort of groups in these areas who are permitted. So largest numbers and available in northern India, it's the Chamars, in the southern region, it's the Paryans, who are available in large numbers, who can touch this material, who can handle these things. So the argument of skill or some kind of traditional skill is actually just it's not translated into anything else, because the work they are doing is completely different from what any of them would have traditionally done historically. Sorry, just one second. Yeah. So then, so new concentration. Then now let me just show you the labor process. What is it that they do in the tanneries? And they, I'll show you what the. Could you just go for the, yeah. So this is of course from Dindigul, which is one of the small clusters that's there, and you have mostly Paryan workers who are from Pondicherry. This was Dindigul is interesting because this is Tipu's area, and tanneries, there's been an earlier history of tanneries. So they were brought in the middle of the 19th century, and they have an interesting struggle for making unions, etc., which I'll come to. But this was the only tannery where, because there's a strong union, I could take photographs. Otherwise, I visited many tanneries across the country, but because they're not following any of the they don't give any protective gear, etc. And here, because of the strong union and the union leader came with me, we could take photographs. So this is how the hides would be piled. The only difference from the colonial period to now would be that some of this would be cement and the pillars, etc. But tanneries are large open spaces. These are salted hides and skins. Could you just go on? So this is how it will be. This will be after what is called soaking. So the first thing is just soaking. Then you essentially, there's this kind of process of scudding of fleshing. They're lined and de-lined. They're put into pits, which would be again in the colonial period. You'd have pits which were, this is from 1948. This is which are smaller, and a lot of young boys, adolescent workers about whom there was they were gradually eased out. But they're standing in pits where there is, the fleshing and the rotting materials are put in. So this is where the smell, you can imagine what it is, but it's also lime water. So constantly they're standing in this lime water, turning it up and down. Don't turn it up and down, it'll rot, right? So goat skins is the earlier picture. If you could just go back to the earlier one. So this is from when my first visit there. And this is where they're actually got just rubber kind of stuff tied around. In terms of name of shoes, they have that. And then these are pits where they are standing and they're constantly turning these around. Yeah, you can just go on. So rotting materials and controlled rotting of these. Then you have a scudding where the flesh is removed from the skin, the flesh and the hair. These will be removed. Flesh is removed later. Initially, it's the hair which is softened. And so after several days, before chemicals come in, all this takes a while. This is from Bombay, from 1903 in Bombay. This is exactly how I also have another, if you can just go on. This is from when I saw it in the early in the 2000s. So this is scudding. This is a blunt knife which they use from both sides. Yeah. So it's on a bark. Yeah. You can just go on. I'll just show. So this is the later process. So after it's fleshed and scudded, so it's like intimately connected to these materials, closely touching them constantly through the day. A kind of, again, concentration of stigmatized work, association with stigmatized materials much more continuously than has ever been before. So in a way, it's a reinscription of caste, so to say, within the labor process and through the labor process. This is the later process after it's cleaned and so on, and then it gets tanned using, in this case, vegetable bark. And nowadays there's a huge market in vegetable tanned leather. This is what actually happened, manual vegetable. I think that's, yeah. Calcutta has this thing of bag tanning. This part has almost gone, these tanneries, and that's again Calcutta is migrant labor and migrant capital. These are Dalit tannery owners who are Adi Dharmis from Punjab, and the workers are Chamars from Bihar who are doing this. So they're stitching the skin up and they're putting the tanning materials in it. In that is called pit tanning, and this is called bag tanning. You can just go on, and this is bag tanning from 1903. This is where because it's vegetable tanning, this is the one part where women are employed, used to be employed, which is grinding the bark. There's something called Myra Bolan, which is put in to remove the redness, and then there's also this kind of bark, which is a particular kind of Cassia auriculata tree. The bark of that tree is used to crush, and that's the material that gives the color. So this is from Bombay, 1930. Where women are mostly employed on the shop floor is cleaning, which is incessant work. And there's people who worked on occupational health, etc. There's salt on the ground. So anybody with injuries on their feet, nothing gets okay. So this is in Erode. Again, there was a strong union. These women were wearing these plastic, whatever, things over the sari. But this is the fleshing which has been removed. So this is, the rotting fleshing is what is used to tan. But you can see the structure of the tannery, and this is just cleaning. Cleaning is incessant work. A lot of the cleaning is done by women. Yeah, and waged. And this is now, today you will have the fleshing, etc. done by machine. This is more, this is about the only process which is mechanized in the tanneries. Yeah, these are chemical tanning, which chemical tanning comes in by the early 20th century, but actually gets widespread only by the middle of the 20th century. And in southern India, you still have a lot of manual processes, etc. So the Kanpur and Calcutta will have a lot of these drums where the tanning part. So after it's safai ke baad wala jo phase hai, colored dalne ke liye, this is what, yeah. So these are just pictures of just general photographs of the tanneries. Yeah. So this is where setting the processing, finishing, dryer processes of tanning. This is again from Bombay. This is the drying. This is how hides are. Yeah, I think. So this is where the workers. This is from this woman's exhibition is on in Delhi. You should go see it. We should go see it. Margaret Borkwhite. She travelled in the 40s, and this is a picture of the Trichy Union, where Trichy sort of workers, where the demands are written, minimum wage, etc. A lot of the workers are children and adolescents. And yeah, this is, I think, the photograph which is there are the as well. Yeah. So I'll just quickly, so this kind of, renewal of stigma through the labor process is something that one is. So it's, in a way, it's not new, it's not old status, right? It's sort of status which is, kind of re-inscribed repeatedly within and through the modern kind of labor processes in tanneries which are linked to modern economy, and it's not traditional identity in that sense, nor is this work really traditional. This is the part which is booming under colonial rule. I mean, this is the part which is growing. So that village servant specializing, which is what Tirthankar Roy says, is something which is, that's not borne out, at least here. Because what's happening with the traditional artisanal sector is that they are getting, those who made leather products traditionally, they also have to depend on the raw materials on these markets, and there you see a lot of deindustrialization actually, because you will see modern shoes, modern kind of the 1930s, 40s, all of those are coming in. So there's a deindustrialization of the artisanal product making kind of segment. But what is booming is this part of work. So this is what so the other is, so this begins to be used both for, caste therefore is used both for, for labor control as well as for workers when they are resisting, when they are negotiating. Stigma and caste become the boundaries also of mobilization and negotiation by workers, and that's the kind of argument that I'm making. But the other, I'll wrap up in a few minutes. So the point is that, of course, so when workers begin to organize themselves, they will organize around caste. But this is not caste as it's given. Please remember that in Calcutta, for instance, you have migrant leather workers, migrant workers from different subcastes, including from different regions. So you have Bilaspuris, there's this group of workers called Bilaspuris who are Satnampantis, who are coming from Chhattisgarh. You have different subgroups from different parts of Bihar and different parts of UP who have come in as workers. Capital, it's migrant capital as well. The Chinese tannery owners, the Punjabi Dalit tannery owners, there are Muslim tannery owners, Iraqi Muslim hide merchants who become tannery owners. So you have migrant labor and migrant capital. But migrant labor, which together then, when they form the earliest union, it's called the Ravidas Ekta Samiti. So they are bound as much by the labor process, by the common work that they are subjected to, as by traditional caste identity, right? And even the Ghasidas worshippers, they will come to this Ravidas Ekta Samiti, and later on when the communists come into this AITUC, so this is till I was going, till 2010-12, the union office was a place called Meeting Ghar in the whole area, and there's a huge statue of Ravidas there, and this is the CPI-led AITUC union, and they take a procession out. It's a very successful union. All the workers in these labor processes were all with this union when it was a very thriving kind of thing, before it was hit by the MC Mehta judgment and polluting industries orders. But even so, even now they remain very strong. So there is caste in a way is being fashioned also anew in Calcutta, right? So it's not traditional caste identity. Labor is very much part of that identity, and they're fighting for, the wage and other economic demands, as well as things of they don't want to get bakshish. They're fighting for bonus, not bakshish. They don't want, those are kinds of things. So this thing of dignity, not being called by caste names, etc., all of those become the basis of forming. So caste also is fashioned anew. It's not in that sense traditional identity as it was in the villages. In Madras, in Dindigul, for instance, there is the Church of Our Lady of Lourdes is there in this area. All the Dalits who are Adi Dravidas are Parayar, they're called Adi Dravidas. They've taken on the identity of Adi Dravidas, and they are the ones, they're Christian. Their first union is set up in 1941, and the flag is a silver cross. The leader is a priest called Peter Samyar, and so they're asking for, again, not to be addressed by caste names. They're asking to, to be allowed to walk through the tannery owners' locality. They're asking for the right to wear a veshti, full-length kind of veshti, and walk through those areas. And it's interesting that the tannery owners are Muslims. But the caste-based modes of domination and control are very much kind of, they are deploying, not surprisingly, those are used. And their struggle is for wages. So their earliest victories, for instance, is, tanneries are being made. In the 40s, they've already brought in this thing of continuous work. Like tanneries will not close for one day. It's not like, but their struggle in that Dindigul union was for a Sunday off. Everybody needs a Sunday off. So it's there again for prayer and so on. But so there's a way in which caste and class are co-articulated, and they are shaped anew, in the context of this kind of reorganized modern kind of economy. So this is the so their identity is also, of course, as Dalits, as Christians, and as workers. So there is no contradiction that they themselves face. 1947, there's Narayanaswamy Naidu's report on the tanning sector, on tanneries in Madras again, and there are similar reports elsewhere, where for the state, I mean, it's a state-led initiative, and he's basically saying that these workers are demanding, wages, bonus. They want, there are all kinds of regular demands, working hours regulation, nothing extraordinary. So he says that given their situation, given how I'm not going to, it will take time to get the quote, but basically that given where they come from, these are excessive demands. So he argues that it's too much. If these workers ask for these demands, it's too much, and perhaps they should moderate it. And this is a report by somebody who says that he's a well-wisher of labor. So he positions himself, and he is actually asking for various kinds of labor rights, but he says that the unions are demanding way too much. So yeah, this is my hierarchies of
I think the two presentations have also raised a lot of questions for us and also underlined certain aspects of change and change in the context of labor conditions. We're also looking at issues of change. We're looking at tradition, colonial state, again changes coming up and transitions in the 19th century. So if I just summarize the two presentations very briefly for you, in the case of the first presentation that we saw two documentaries, where I think the documentaries really brought up one presented before us a case of colonial tea plantations and a transition from that 19th and changes in the 20th century. Raise questions of gender and work. We're looking not just at women and work, but also gendering of work, sections of work and labor which are reserved exclusively for men and women. We're looking at questions of health, nutrition, also I think medicine, herbs, and it's important to also think of local labor and local knowledge systems there and the role they play in the way in which work is organized. We're also looking at changes in working conditions. Again, the two documentaries I think also brought that out. Also, I think the one thing that really struck me in the second was comments about the contractual nature of work, permanent nature of work, the kinds of expectations of what's going to happen post-retirement, land, place to live, also social community, social events, especially religion, as an important binding force. And I think that's something which also brings together both these presentations. We're looking at religion, trade unionism in the case of leather industry, changes in the nature of work, also how in the late 19th century with export industry, changes in the nature of the leather industry. We're also looking at new groups, migrant labor. We're looking also at not just new laboring groups, but also this new scale of production, how kind of impact that has on the groups that are employed, the groups that are now joining in. Also, we are looking at a new kinds of specializations that are emerging. The one thing I think that came up was also one image of the women working with plant dyes, which again gave us a glimpse of gendering of work, also how the men are employed in all of the other aspects of work. Lastly, also this discussion on trade unions and the kind of pushbacks, the questions about caste, class, and also religion, and the role religion again plays in bringing everything together. So thank you very much, Shahana and Rana, for your presentations. And I'd like to open this discussion up to questions. Would you like to say something before?
I'd rather you people ask questions because I think you're really intelligent. You studied in college, I guess you read not more than others. But now this industry, they just celebrated 200 years of existence. I just play the keywords. To begin with migration. Okay? These workers, they were brought to work from Chotanagpur, Santas Pargana, but now, I will say, they were put under a contract by 1865, which came to be known as the indenture contract. The industry brought this labor every year. The recruitment and transportation of this labor force, starting from 1840, it continued till about 1960. So we are talking of a century, more than a century. That's why I called my book 100 Years to Servitude. So migration, being bonded to work in the plantation, and the labor relations. In many ways, what Shahana has presented, they deny dignity. They deny dignity of labor. You saw the second that this woman starts working with this, because that's their living. They also do karma puja. Once in a year, there is a karma puja. You'll find that day you can't get your scooter repaired. There are traditional way in which people can keep their identities, not get lost. Here the identity can't be lost because they have already been branded. Chamara hai, wo hai, ye hai. Then there is a question of age, there is a question of sickness, mortality, bondage. Officially the bondage is dissolved in 1925. Then the planters bring up another way of controlling it. And the most important part is the hierarchy. You saw the way in which the Sahib is giving the wage, showing doesn't hand them over. You also saw the incredible amount of hard work, like she shown. They have to start at 4 in the morning. The tradition, have you ever been to Assam, any of you? Are you from Assam?
No, just visited there.
You went to visit. One of my former students, she was a classmate, Yovita Sharma, she wrote a book where she said these plantations are called gardens. You know, the Europeans and the British, unlike the Mughals, are very fascinated with the idea of a garden. The French have gardens which are very spruced up and flowers and this and that. The British like very wilderness kind of garden. So this is the British garden. What happens inside the garden you are not supposed to know. As you can also see, there is not much of a change, despite the fact over 200 years. This woman is still complaining that if I don't work, where am I going to eat? The average wage today in the plantation is no more than 165 rupees a day, which you probably end up eating a dosa, a cheaper shop. I like it. Then you have any number of questions, please ask.
Actually, one of the things that one of the things I find quite interesting, I mean, we are now teaching labor history as an option for
Yeah.
the fourth year.
Yeah.
Some of our students are here. But while teaching it also, like, this is, plantation is strictly formal sector, associated with supposedly regulations, etc. But look at the modes of, the existence of labor, the forms of control, etc. And tanning, I forgot to say, is entirely, mostly informal, except I haven't shown you any of the images of the formal units, which are very few. It's mostly largely informal, lots of small. But again, there's a commonality in the ways in which labor is controlled. The modes of control are very similar.
Yeah.
And the modes of humiliation, modes of punishment, I mean, those are all quite similar actually.
I think we should open it up for
Yeah.
questions. Do you
Please,
people have
don't
questions?
feel embarrassed.
Ah,
You might think silly questions, how does it matter?
and we both
Exam थोड़ी दे रहे हैं।
undergrad people, so it's
Hi, my name is Vaibhav. My question is on the films. In the first film, we saw there were consequences on the health of the people involved in the work. So, how has that evolved over a century? And the second question is from the next film. We saw the worker wanted one of her sons to get a job. Now, and she also said that this is all she had. In a way, it is also keeping them in the plantation. It's in a way informally tied to the plantations. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You see, I mentioned indenture. Maybe some of you may have read any book on indenture. The indenture was very widespread. Most of indentured labor around the world were recruited and transported by the British companies, both in Assam and overseas. So the labor force migration began from sometime around early 19th century after the abolition of slavery. Now, what you are saying, which basically signifies they are not yet able to work enough to save money. They are tied up with the plantation. The difference is now they continue to bring labor force to refresh the labor pool. And as I said, that process continued till 1960. That process itself was very profitable to the company because they brought this labor and sold the labor and made money out of it. These were done by the large companies who sent the recruiters to bring this labor. But the second thing tells you, from morning till night, the amount of work, the work process, carrying the weight on their head, rain or no rain. They're still not wearing shoes, not all of them. They're working in the sun, they're working in the rain, they're working in the cold, they're working in the summer. And tough life, very hard life. I know a number of younger scholars have been working both in the Northeast as well as overseas students who have had opportunities to actually live with the labor and work with them. There are a good number of MPhils and PhD dissertations in many universities. It doesn't really show a great deal of improvement in the economic conditions of the health, in the food. You saw they eating only rice. You saw the plate? You have a lot of rice. I calculated the consumption pattern in the plantations and I came to the understanding that 60% of the diet consists of only rice. She told you they get rice and they get many things. So rice is something which is the major form of consumption and you can say the health. You know? So these are some of the very important issues of how the labor, in the case of Assam, till very recently they were called coolies. Now, as she said, they don't want to be called coolies. They want to be called Adivasis. So it also shows the nature of assertion which a labor force can put up now. So, have I satisfied you?
I have a question. Thank you, ma'am. I have a question from Bhattacharya. As you have told us about the relationships in the tanneries, when it was shifted from a village household economy to a modern leather industries in the clusters of the segregated neighborhoods of the cities. So the relation was like the Muslims were mostly the tannery owners and the lower castes were the laborers. So I'm interested to know that what was the impact in the 1920s, 30s. There was a sweeping Hinduization and all. So how it impacted and interesting in during partition. So what was the impact? How these relationships were reconfigured because these Arya Samajis and Hinduization, whatever was happening, they were trying to cast them into their own fold. So what kind of was there the relationship between the Muslim owners and the laborers? Did it get impacted, affected, or how it was, and whether these lower castes were able to sustain their local kind of religious customs and all? I'm interested in that. If you could
I can only partially try to talk about this, but so as far as mobilization of workers in Bombay, I found much more evidence of the Adi Dravida being mobilized as Hindus in the 20s and 30s. So they are Ganesh Puja processions taken through Dharavi and in front of the Badi Masjid of Dharavi, which is Tinelveli High Tanner had made that mosque and so on. But as far as the overall politics is concerned, I don't think that. So these are a lot of the Tamil migrants, later in the 60s, 70s, etc. When Shiv Sena, etc. are rising, they're actually mobilizing against outsiders. Some of the Tamils will also go into the underworld, etc. in the later politics of the 70s. But when you're looking at this earlier period, 20s, 30s, some of them, these same workers are being mobilized, but it's not a very, as far as I've made out, because the tanneries soon join in the kind of, the sweeping rounds. So in the 30s, it's the tanneries after the cotton mills and so on. You will have these tanneries which are joining that wave of strikes also. So there are lots of parallel mobilizations in Bombay. In southern India, the word Turk is used, the Tamil equivalent of that word is used for the tannery owners here. But the caste-based mode, caste remains much more dominant in terms of that. And there are Muslims on the shop floor. But the way the pattern has been is that they are getting more into the drier processes. Many of them will be in the supervisory kind of position of. So you have the person who knows the work is called the Mestri, and he'll be from the Dalit caste only. But you have there are enough Muslims who know the work, who can direct people, etc. They may be the owner, but some of them are there in the labor process and in the drier process. Likewise in Calcutta, you have the pit work, I think I haven't done a survey all over the country now, but I think a lot of the wet work of tanning is really done by Dalits in most regions. But it's the lowest end, even if there are some Muslims in it. So in Kanpur in in a report in the 1940s, there is one Brahmin who is in the tannery pits and he's hiding. He doesn't tell his relatives. In one of the inquiries it comes out, and he doesn't want to tell his relatives that he's doing this work in the city. So it's not like there aren't any people from other communities who are there, but there are, most of the work is being done by, so there is some communal mobilization, but it doesn't really, somehow these areas are left out of that loop. The history of but where mobilization does happen, you'll see some amount of Congress mobilization succeeding. So this Ravidas Ekta Samaj is actually, and the other interesting thing is some small tannery owners are called in to become leaders of the unions. So there's there's a Muslim Congress-linked tannery owner who's a petty tannery owner who is called in the Madras region to become one of the leaders of the union in the central part, right? And is called Sattar. And then later the communists come in, and communists, maybe there'll be Brahmin communists who be brought in. The owners will insult them by making them wear garlands of shoes. So again, that mode of so you have the kind of Congress and then later communists coming in this sector, at least in the modern tanning sectors. But in Bombay, it's a slightly different story, but there also I think you have this kind of a much more mix of political forces which are there up till the 40s, 50s. उसके आगे का अलग histories है, but
Ma'am, since a part of this documentary and a part of your presentation was about how certain occupations are gendered, like how certain occupations are associated with particular genders, I wanted to know what role, if any, the labor movement has played in overcoming these traditional gender barriers associated with particular occupations.
okay. You want to talk about it also?
Okay, I think the tea industry is probably one of the few industries which employs a very large number of women actually. And I was wondering why. For some reason, the planters thought, the women have a very nimble fingers. The tea, have you ever read a novel called Two Leaves and a Bud? Okay, doesn't matter. Then when you saw them picking, they had to pick only 2 leaves and a bud. If they pick up other leaves, then the tea becomes poor quality. So it's very important that they believe the women have the skill better than the men. It worked out very well because the wages of women and children were always lower than the men. From 1865 till well into the 1920s, the minimum wage fixed for 5 rupees per month for a man, 4 rupees for a woman, and 3 rupees for children. This remained the pattern for a long, long time. So you imagine if the labor force of women and children consists of more than 50%, the wage over time, you can actually, you pay less for the same amount of work. So it kind of became a tradition that women are known to be, not that the men, you saw some men also, but predominantly it's the women. They also believe the women are more controllable than the men. But contrary to evidence, what at least in my work, women were as aggressive as the men were. In fact, the women were the ones who were for greater deal of sexual harassment, bad treatment, plus the domestic work where the husband-in-laws will beat the hell out of them. So the women actually suffered the most in any industry. They were always made to work as much, pay less, and they were supposed to keep their mouth shut. So I think this idea that the only women who do certain kinds of work is something which over time was determined not necessarily because of the level of skill, but question of economy, question of control, the question of taming them, and actually women has always been the worst sufferer in any. The interesting thing is the participation of women in industry began to decline from the late 19th century except in the tea industry. That's a very interesting question.
But did unions take up the question of women? I mean, did women participate in struggles and so on?
Oh yes. Women were always part of any struggle. They were not behind. It's an interesting thing which we talk about in the context of caste. Now, there were no caste as such, but there were different tribal communities. These are Santalis, these are Mundas, these are different kind of communities who come to work there. They maintain their identity. They still speak their language to each other, but there is a common language, kind of a Creole. That lady speaks very good Assamese, no? Which is not always true. So the filmmaker obviously selected somebody who was better off, who speaks Assamese very well, but despite all that, you could see that she was also in a difficult time. So the women remained constantly, There were many cases where a woman was, it was very common for the planters or their the hierarchy in the plantation, you have a Bada Sahib and you have a Chota Sahib. Chota Sahib is a new recruit from England, and the Bada Sahib is a senior Sahib. So I actually wrote a very nice paper, I think it's a nice paper, which is published in the Journal of Asian Studies, where I wrote Bada Sahib and Chota Sahib, So that's the hierarchy. But then you have a lower hierarchy, which are the local people, Same with the kind of hierarchies, There are these clerical people, Babus, who are mostly Bengalis, later on Assamese. And then you have the people chosen from within among the labor. The word came Sardar. He is supposed to be a supervisor. There is a Muharrir. So there is a whole nature of hierarchy which basically have to keep these people under control. They are constantly watching. Even today, if you go to the garden, you will find Bada Sahib, now the Bada Sahibs are busy, so they will wear their shorts, and the Chota Sahib wearing their shorts, they have their bungalows. The Bada Sahib has a bigger bungalow, the Chota Sahib has a smaller bungalow, but they have to wake up 5 in the morning, they be on the garden. If they drunk till 3 in the morning, doesn't matter, they still have to be there. The planters are one of the greatest consumers of liquor, and they're very, very hospitable. If you ever go to the plantation, you will have their great, the place looks beautiful. The whole landscape is incredible, But life of labor, no better than anybody else.
Tanneries, the women are, like he said, with mines and tanneries and so on, women are officially not supposed to be there, especially in the 20th century. They're external from those labor processes. But on the shop floor, actually, they're always there doing this work, like sort of one cleaning, which till now will continue, when tanning materials are getting pounded in machines and so on. But earlier, pounding the bark, pounding all of those kind of work, so they're constantly there and always bare feet, lowest paid, and so on. As far as unions are concerned, they actually, and this Margaret Bourke talks about these women who are including women in advanced stages of pregnancy who are working with families. All this pit work is collectively waged. They're not paid individually. So people do attendant work around it, and women are very much there on the shop floor. But unions, while they take up the question of caste, in this area the unions had not really taken up till the 80s, at least they hadn't taken up these questions of women's, I mean, so then women did start putting pressure, and you have kind of this question of occupational health of the cleaners and all of that being taken up, but it doesn't get taken up so actively at that time. Though this question of women as, the earliest union stories, the myths about why you need to fight this thing is, so you were talking about communism, so this thing of the owner raping the wife of a worker, that kind of narrative, I mean, it may be true, we don't really know, but then how much, but it is this honor of women ko leke na, there's a lot of mobilizing of workers around this thing. So gender will appear like that, but as far as actually taking up, I mean, as I said, they're officially invisible, these women.
She mentioned about the Margaret White, and the Indian photographer was that time. He was a phenomenal
Sunil
photographer.
Jana.
Yeah. You see, with the exhibition on in the Indira Gandhi junction at just on the
IGNC.
side of the western coast, in Janpad. If you have time, you must go and see. The photographs are unbelievable, incredible photographs. You will be shocked the kind of photographs they could produce. And these are photographs, mind you, go back to 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And these are black and white photographs. The one she showed, that young boy, that photograph is part of that. So if you have time, it's worth going and seeing this, because you will never see them otherwise, unless you read her book.
And it's very difficult to get that book, not
Yeah,
easy.
you know? Yeah.
We're running short of time, but what I'll do is I'd like to take two questions. So I'll ask, you can ask your question, someone else from this side. So we'll take 2-3 questions and then
Let's
let
club.
us-
If there is tea
We'll
outside,
club them together.
And
we can have more discussion.
My question is from the point of view of politics of knowledge. As we saw that both of the industries, be it plantation or the tannery, are imposed by the colonial powers. So, can we say that the knowledge system, our traditional knowledge system in these spheres got perished because of these impositions? And how the people or the labor associated with it got affected, keeping in mind the ecology related with it?
But in the case of,
We just club.
Not a kind of question, but also an intervention. As you just talking about the numbers of women, they used to migrate on a permanent basis, right, from Santar and Jogana area. So basically, even women were more ideal for the planters because they wanted to reproduce the labor community there altogether. Because women is something which gives the reproductive capacity of that particular community. And also to ma'am, basically you just pointed out about the caste and how caste was just recreated at the stage of destination. So I'm working on migration, particularly from Behal to Kaalchakra. So even these, these castes were basically landless laborers wearing their space of origin altogether, right? Completely, the person who was basically working on the labor working on. And earlier, as Narayan Rao also pointed out, these people are basically earlier in the Asian period or the early medieval period, they were the labor communities who earlier used to work on the labor working work. So we could see that how, I wouldn't say modern economy, because I was also grappling with your postulation that you just said that these were the, there is a functional transition, right, within the technique of work. But also these are something which is not completely modern, but is a kind of reconsolidation of caste within the space of destination through the new technique that colonialism altogether brought here.
Ma'am, my question is to you. Ma'am, it's actually quite simple, but I wanted to ask about why are these works not transformed into machine kind of processes? Why are they still procuring labor and Adivasis? Why can't they change their mode of production to machine-made work? It could maximize their profits.
so your question, the whole idea of sociology of knowledge. In the case of tea wasn't drunk. Tea was mostly exported by China and Japan. There's a long history of tea in Europe. Some of you may have done your course on Chinese-Japanese history. You may remember the Opium War. The Opium War, a catalyst for the East India Company to find an alternative source of tea. So by that time, the tea had become a national drink of England. So I'll discuss in my book, so it will be too long for me to explain. Now, so they began looking where to get tea. They made many efforts in many countries, Brazil, here or there. And they found that tea actually grew in the upper parts of Assam. But not like this. They were trees. So about 20 years' time, they were able to, including getting knowledge from China and even the labor from China, to set up a tea nursery by mid-30s. And finally, they succeeded in producing tea. They changed the whole nature of the, it's not just the production, it's also what you do with the ecology, what you do with the nature. You know, the tea actually, if you see a fully grown tea bush, it'll be up to 40 feet high. But they made it a bona. Okay? That is why every year they'll keep chopping and make it a very beautiful landscape. So then onwards, this was the whole practice, which they learned from the traditional Assamese and from the Chinese and put into practice. So labor had to be trained. Most labor came from agrarian backgrounds. It wasn't so difficult for them to pick this up. So actually, if you compare the Indian tea industry with the Chinese tea industry, Chinese don't do this kind of large plantation. Predominantly agrarian, but of course they have traders, others. In the case of India, they change the whole nature of production, okay, which continues today. Now, of course, you have a small tea garden, so actually using what the Chinese were doing at that time, 2 acres, 4 acres, family land, to start producing there. Okay? So the sociology and knowledge over time percolated now to the Assamese farmers who have started producing tea for small tea garden. They produce 50% of the tea in Assam now. The rest you can take.
So traditional knowledge about leather, there's also this thing of meanings of work, no? It's kind of really, we don't have time to talk, we can talk about it. Meanings of these materials. So चमड़े के काम को क्या लोग skilled, ये वाला जो काम है, the early processing, is that associated with knowledge or skill? Is that considered? What is the meaning of that work for the worker? Because it's produced in a very traditional kind of stigmatized workers, etc. So in a very different context. So then that is not, so what is actually expanding is kind of that's multiplied many times over and concentrated, and it's a total reorganization, and that's happening only within modernity. Within traditional Indian setup, you didn't actually have scope for this expansion, and I'm not sure how much the workers would consider this early work. So what is considered skilled would be the product making. Iske saath notions of skilled workers, so those are areas of inquiry, but one has to look at what do things mean, what does work mean, and most people here would be working to be free of work. Work doesn't bring redemption and this idea of work. So I think those are areas where we must think when we're talking about traditional knowledge, because it's also associated with that. Why are they not mechanizing? Good question. They only mechanize certain processes. And these are processes that could be mechanized elsewhere. They are getting mechanized. And let me just give you a small, again, anecdotal kind of argument that there was, there's a Central Leather Research Institute, and they had developed something called a flaying machine. मतलब चमड़ा को machine से निकालने का वो है. They set up these flaying stations in some areas, and in many parts of India, There are very few workers available. So they kind of, but in Rajasthan, in one area, and the machine got broken down, and the person got attacked, the engineer who went. And after some times, several times this happened, and then the village person, the headman, who was also some kind of a big, I mean, he was in a modern economy at some point and had retired into the village. He said, what are you doing? How can you mechanize this? Because it's that association with that chamda nikalne wala kaam jo karte hain, that is what is keeping these people in check. And this was narrated to me by the director of the Central Leather Research Institute. Just gives you an idea. I mean, I'm saying that this selective mechanization is also significant because it doesn't, it's what gets mechanized and what doesn't, who touches what, etc. As far as reconstitution, I mean, that's an interesting argument. But the thing is that the scale of this work is so much that there is absolutely no scope in medieval times for this kind of work. You know, so that's why. You know, the way in which the so-called Jajmani system, the way in which it's organized is one or two families will be doing this work as the need arises. Most of the year they are doing, as Rawat says and others have argued, that they are doing agricultural labor. Yeah. And sometimes they're also owning, I mean, even if we don't accept what Washbrook Golden Age of Paraya, but you know, they also own land. I mean, before the tenurial kind of changes that take place in the 19th century. So this kind of association is quite new, because also this concentration of work and the rhythms of work, the schedules and so on, all of that is completely new. And not all families and not everybody would be like this colonial ethnographic category of leather worker. Is not कि सबको वो knowledge है ना? So that's the, yeah, but I would love to talk to you about your work.
Thank you, Shahana, and thank you, Rana. We now break for tea, and we also have Pankaj who's come, so we forward to meeting everyone.
One second, I'm going to give please be seated. I would like to invite the person.
Yeah, the students.
On behalf of History Society, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Shahana Bhattacharya and Dr. Rana Behal. We are also grateful to Professor Mahesh Gopalan for generously agreeing to moderate the event. We would like to present you with a token of our appreciations. I request Sabina Kazmi ma'am to kindly present the memento to Sarin ma'am.
Wow. Very nice, thank you.
I want to thank everyone whose support allowed this event to happen. Finally, a big thank you to the audience who joined us today and made this event a success. We have another event happening at 4 p.m. A lecture by Dr. Pankaj Jha titled Culture of Servitude in North Indian Poetry. Hope you see you there.